For 2 full seasons, Caitlin Clark has been the most physically targeted player in professional basketball. Hard fouls, aggressive traps, contact that went well beyond competitive defense and crossed into something that looked a lot more like a message being sent. Opponents around the league understood something very clearly from the moment she stepped onto a professional court. The Indiana Fever would not protect her. The coaching staff would stand on the sideline with arms crossed. The roster around her lacked the physical presence to make cheap shots expensive. So the cheap shots kept coming. And Clark kept getting up, kept playing, kept performing at a level that defied the circumstances around her, while the people responsible for creating better circumstances seemed content to watch it happen. That era is over. Not because the coaching staff finally figured it out. Not because the front office completed an independent assessment of what the roster was missing and filled the gap through conventional organizational channels. Because Caitlin Clark picked up the phone. Myisha Hines-Allen is now an Indiana Fever, and the way that signing happened tells you more about where this franchise is actually headed than any press conference or media availability or carefully worded organizational statement ever could. Hines-Allen didn't sign because Indiana presented the most attractive contract. She didn't sign because the city appealed to her or the roster depth was impressive or the coaching staff made a compelling pitch about her role in the system. She signed because Caitlin Clark personally called her and said she wanted her there. That's the starting point, and everything that follows from it changes the conversation about this team completely. Media day productions in professional sports are largely choreographed events. Players arrive. They sit in front of cameras. They deliver the approved language about excitement and opportunity and team culture. The substance is usually thin, and the authenticity is usually thinner. What Myisha Hines-Allen said at Indiana Fever Media Day was not that. She was direct about it in a way that left absolutely no room for interpretation or diplomatic softening. Clark's personal recruitment was the reason she signed. Full stop. Not a contributing factor, not one element among several that made Indiana attractive. The reason. Once she heard that Caitlin Clark wanted her in Indiana, the conversation was essentially over. There were no follow-up questions about contract structure or role definition or organizational direction that would have changed the outcome. The call from Clark was the offer that mattered. Everything else was paperwork. She also said something about Clark specifically that deserves to be taken seriously rather than filed away as standard media day flattery. One of the greatest players ever to play the game. That is not a phrase that veteran professional athletes use casually about teammates. It is not the kind of language that shows up in scripted media availability responses. Veteran players have spent careers around talented people. They have developed calibrated assessments of greatness that are informed by real experience and genuine comparison. When a professional with that kind of reference point uses that specific language, it reflects an actual belief. Hines-Allen has been around this league long enough to know the difference between a very good player and a historically significant one. Her characterization of Clark was not generous hyperbole. It was a veteran's honest assessment. But the more important element of what she said is the structural implication of how the signing happened. When a veteran player signs with a franchise specifically because the franchise star recruited her, the power dynamic of that organization has been made visible in a way that cannot be walked back. It tells you who is actually driving decisions. It tells you what voices carry genuine weight when roster construction conversations happen. It tells you that the player at the center of this franchise has moved beyond simply performing within the organizational structure and has become an active architect of it. For Indiana specifically, this is a significant development because the organizational structure around Clark has been one of the central sources of her professional frustration. The inability to translate her individual excellence into team success. The absence of pieces that matched her competitive level. The feeling, visible in her body language across 2 seasons, of someone fighting battles that the people around her were not equipped to help her win. Now she is recruiting the people she needs, and they are coming. What that means for the franchise's direction is something the rest of this conversation is going to unpack. But it starts with understanding exactly who she recruited and why the analytics behind that choice are more compelling than almost anything else happening in the league right now. Plus 9.6 defensive net points. That number is the beginning and the end of the analytical case for why the Hines-Allen signing is significant. Everything else is context and explanation. The number itself is the argument. Defensive net points measure the difference in points allowed per 100 possessions when a specific player is on the court versus off it. It is not a counting stat. It is not a measure of individual defensive plays made. It captures the actual impact a defender has on the team's defensive performance as a functioning unit when she is present versus absent. A positive defensive net points figure means the defense is better when the player is on the floor. The magnitude of that figure tells you how much better. Plus 9.6 is not a marginal positive. It is not the kind of number that reflects a solid defensive contributor who helps at the margins. Plus 9.6 defensive net points led the entire WNBA. Every player in the league, every roster in every city, every defender at every position. Myisha Hines-Allen was mathematically the most impactful defensive player in professional women's basketball. Let that establish itself fully before moving past it. The narratives that have circulated around the Indiana Fever roster have been largely negative for 2 seasons. Soft, unprotected, physically outmatched. A team that produces extraordinary individual numbers from its franchise player while being exploited systemically because the pieces around her lack the physical and defensive credibility to change opponent behavior. The Hines-Allen signing does not address every element of that critique, but the specific element it addresses is the most analytically significant one. The team just added the player who had the highest defensive net points in the entire league. This is not organizational sentiment. This is not a front office making a move that looks good in a press release. This is a measurable, documented, analytically validated acquisition of the most impactful defensive player in the sport. The numbers do not care about narratives. They do not adjust for storyline preferences or media framing or the established perception of a franchise. They measure what actually happened on the court when a specific player was present versus absent. And what actually happened when Myisha Hines-Allen was present was that the defensive performance of her team improved by nearly 10 points per 100 possessions. For Indiana, a team that has been defensively exploitable in ways that directly affected Clark's offensive performance and the team's overall competitive ceiling. Adding a player who produces that kind of defensive net points swing is transformational on paper. Whether the transformation materializes on the court depends on factors that the analytics cannot fully predict. But the foundation for the argument is as strong as any single signing in the league's recent history. The math says this was the right move. Clark's phone call is why it happened. Those 2 things together tell you something important about this franchise's direction. The word enforcer carries connotations in basketball that are not fully accurate to what the role actually produces. The image that surfaces is physical, flagrant fouls, hard elbows, the kind of aggressive contact that results in technical fouls and ejections and highlights that look more like a brawl than a basketball game. That version of enforcement exists, but it is not the primary mechanism by which an enforcer changes a game. The primary mechanism is deterrence. Think about the security guard standing in the doorway of a building. The security guard's job is not to fight everyone who tries to enter illegally. The security guard's job is to be present in a way that changes the calculation of anyone considering an illegal entry. The fight that doesn't happen because the deterrent exists is the security guard's most important contribution. It never appears in any incident report. It is invisible in the data, but it is real. Myisha Hines-Allen in the paint operates on exactly this principle. Opposing players who have spent 2 seasons reading the Indiana Fever as a team without physical consequences for aggressive contact now have to recalculate. Not because Hines-Allen will necessarily respond to every cheap shot with a retaliatory foul, but because the awareness that she is capable of making that choice, that she has the physical presence and the competitive temperament to change the cost-benefit equation of targeting Clark or anyone else on the roster, changes opponent behavior before any contact occurs. This is the dimension of the signing that will not show up cleanly in box scores. Fouls that are never committed do not generate statistics. Physical plays that are reconsidered because the enforcer is standing in the paint do not appear in any game log, but they are the actual product the enforcer is delivering. The psychological dimension of defensive intimidation is real, and it is measurable in the aggregate even when it is invisible in the individual play. Teams that have physical presences in the paint force opponents into different shot selection patterns, away from the rim, toward the perimeter, where the physical consequences of contested attempts are lower. This changes the quality of opponent possessions in ways that accumulate across a season into meaningful competitive advantages. Clark has been operating without this protection for 2 full seasons, without the deterrent, without the psychological barrier that makes opponents think twice about the physical approach to defending her. Adding Hines-Allen does not automatically solve every problem on this roster, but it addresses the specific problem that the deterrent absence created, and it addresses it with the player who led the entire league in the metric that most directly captures defensive impact. The enforcer is not the fighter. The enforcer is the presence that makes fighting unnecessary. Indiana has that presence now, and the league is going to feel it. 2 seasons of professional basketball, 2 seasons of absorbing physical punishment at a rate and intensity that had no parallel in the league. 2 seasons of getting up off the floor, shaking off the contact, and continuing to perform while the organizational infrastructure around her remained inadequate to address the root cause of the problem. Clark never stopped competing. The numbers across both seasons reflect a player who refused to let the physical environment determine her output. The performances under those conditions were in some ways more impressive than what the statistics captured because they required a level of mental and physical toughness that the comfortable narrative of athlete privilege cannot accommodate. But toughness has a cost, and operating without physical protection for 2 seasons has a cost. The freedom that an enforcer creates for a player like Clark is not just physical, it is cognitive. When you know that cheap shots will go unanswered, a portion of your mental processing capacity goes toward managing that reality, toward being aware of contact that is coming, toward protecting yourself in situations where the roster around you is not going to provide that protection, toward absorbing the energy expenditure of regular physical punishment without the psychological relief of knowing it has consequences for the people delivering it. When you know the enforcer is in the paint, that processing burden is redistributed. The awareness of incoming cheap shots diminishes because the deterrent changes opponent behavior. The energy that was going toward physical self-management becomes available for basketball, for reading the defense, for locating the open teammate, for the creative decision-making that makes Clark historically significant. The freedom to operate in transition is a specific dimension of this that deserves attention. Clark's transition game is one of the most dangerous offensive weapons in the sport. The speed of her decision-making in open court, the range that makes defenders respect her from distances that most players cannot threaten from, the court vision that finds the right play before the defense can set and communicate. Opponents have been willing to foul aggressively in transition specifically because there was no physical deterrent waiting in the paint. The calculation was simple. The cost of letting Clark operate freely in transition exceeded the cost of the foul, especially when the physical consequences of the foul were minimal. With Hines-Allen present, that calculation changes. The cost of physical aggression toward Clark is no longer a one-way street. The deterrent exists. The enforcement capability exists. The Clark who operates knowing that protection is genuinely present is a different offensive weapon than the Clark who has been fighting alone for 2 seasons. The league is about to see the difference. The Hines-Allen impact on Clark is the most visible dimension of this signing, but the effect on Aaliyah Boston deserves serious attention because it changes a different part of the floor in ways that compound with what the Clark dimension produces. Boston has developed into a genuine offensive presence at the center position. Her skill set in the post, her ability to operate in the mid-range, her development as a receiver who can finish around the rim, all of these have progressed in ways that reflect real work and genuine improvement over the course of her professional career. The limitation that has persisted is the physical dimension of interior play. Boston has faced consistent aggression in the paint from opponents who understood that interior physicality was an exploitable characteristic of the Indiana roster, not because Boston lacks toughness fundamentally, but because without a physical insurance policy alongside her, the aggressive approach to defending her carried no meaningful cost. Hines-Allen changes this calculation directly. When 2 physical presences are operating simultaneously in the Indiana interior, the opponent's defensive approach to Boston changes. The aggressive contact that was available without consequence when Boston was the only significant interior presence now carries the risk of activating Hines-Allen's enforcer function. The deterrent that protects Clark in the perimeter and transition game also protects Boston in the post. The compounding effect of this is significant. Boston operating against opponents who have recalibrated their physical approach because Hines-Allen is present is a different player than Boston absorbing the full weight of opponent interior aggression without a physical partner to redistribute that attention. The paint becomes genuinely difficult to operate in for opposing offenses when both Boston and Hines-Allen are on the floor simultaneously. 2 physical presences, 2 defensive players whose combined impact on the interior defensive structure creates barriers that single-player interior defense cannot replicate. For Indiana opponents who have treated the Fever interior as a manageable defensive target for 2 seasons, the landscape has changed. The paint that was accessible is now occupied by the most impactful defensive player in the league, alongside a developing center who benefits directly from the presence alongside her. The interior dimension of Indiana's defense in 2025 is not the same conversation it was in 2024, and the difference is Myisha Hines-Allen. Everything above represents the genuine analytical case for why this signing is significant and why the Hines-Allen addition changes the competitive picture for Indiana in meaningful ways. Now let's talk about the thing that needs to be corrected immediately before it becomes a recurring problem. Myisha Hines-Allen securing defensive rebounds and initiating transition by dribbling up the court herself. This has appeared in practice footage and early observation, and it needs to be addressed directly and specifically before it becomes a habit that generates unnecessary turnovers at critical moments in competitive games. The instruction is simple, and it should not need to be complicated. When Hines-Allen secures a defensive rebound, her responsibility ends at identifying Caitlin Clark, holding the ball, allowing Clark to use her movement to create separation from the face guard coverage that opponents deploy against her, and delivering the pass to Clark in a position where she can initiate the transition offense that Indiana runs most lethally. That is the job: secure the rebound, find Clark, hold, deliver. It is not secure the rebound and attempt to push transition as a ball-handling big. The reasons this specific correction matters go beyond general ball security concerns. Hines-Allen is an elite interior defender with a plus 9.6 defensive net points that reflect a genuine and historically significant defensive skill set. She is not a guard. She is not a playmaker in transition. She does not have the ball-handling reliability or the decision-making speed in open court that transition initiation requires at the level the Fever need it to function. When she attempts to dribble up the court after a defensive rebound, she is creating turnover risk in exactly the situations where the Fever should be generating their most efficient offensive possessions. The defensive rebound that begins a Clark-led transition is one of Indiana's most dangerous offensive sequences. Converting that sequence into a Hines-Allen dribble penetration attempt is not a small inefficiency. It is a fundamental misuse of the possession. Clark's movement off the ball after an Indiana defensive rebound is intentional and sophisticated. She is creating separation from the face guard. She is using cuts and directional changes to get into a position where she can receive the outlet pass and immediately attack a defense that is not yet set. That process requires a passer who is patient enough to hold the ball while Clark works free, who trusts that the wait is worth it, who understands that getting the ball to Clark in transition is worth more than any alternative use of that possession. Hines-Allen dribbling up the court eliminates that option and replaces it with a ball handler who is not equipped to replicate what Clark produces in the same situation. This is a correctable flaw. It is not a character issue or a talent issue or an indication that the signing was wrong. It is a habit that needs to be addressed in practice and reinforced consistently until the correct behavior is automatic. Secure the rebound, find Clark, hold, deliver. Everything else the enforcer does is right. This one thing needs to change. The Hines-Allen signing, taken in isolation, is a good basketball move with strong analytical support. Taken in the context of how it happened, it is something more interesting and more significant than a single good roster decision. Caitlin Clark personally recruited Myisha Hines-Allen. Her call was the deciding factor in the signing. The player who leads the WNBA in defensive net points chose Indiana because the franchise star wanted her there. This is not the first indicator that Clark's influence on roster construction has been growing. The pattern of her involvement in organizational decisions has been visible to people paying close attention. But the Hines-Allen signing made that influence explicit in a way that could not be managed into the background of normal organizational messaging. Hines-Allen said it out loud at Media Day. Clark recruited her. Clark's interest was the reason she came. What does it mean when a franchise player is actively identifying and recruiting the pieces she needs to win? One interpretation is that the organizational structure has failed to provide those pieces independently, and the player has had to fill the gap herself. This interpretation is not flattering to the front office. It suggests that 2 seasons of watching Clark absorb physical punishment without adequate protection did not produce the organizational urgency that one phone call from Clark produced. A second interpretation is that the front office has reached a mature and intelligent understanding of their assets' judgment and is actively creating space for her to exercise influence in roster construction, because her understanding of what she needs to win is more accurate than what a conventional organizational evaluation process would produce. The most honest interpretation is probably some combination of both. The front office missed the enforcer need for 2 seasons. The evidence for that need was visible in every game Clark played under physical duress without adequate protection. The analytical support for a signing like Hines-Allen was available before Clark made the call that produced the signing. The organizational failure to identify and address the gap independently is real. And simultaneously, when Clark exercised her influence directly, the front office responded. They let the signing happen. They supported the outcome that Clark's recruitment produced. They demonstrated a willingness to align organizational decisions with what the franchise player identified as the missing piece. Smart organizational strategy around a player of Clark's caliber looks like giving her meaningful input into the construction of the roster she plays within. Not unlimited control, not the replacement of professional evaluation with player preference on every decision, but genuine responsiveness to what the player who understands her own needs better than anyone else in the building identifies as the gap. The Hines-Allen signing is evidence that Indiana is moving toward that model, even if the path to it was longer and more painful than it needed to be. Clark is not officially the general manager, but she is shaping this roster in ways that matter, and the analytics behind Hines-Allen suggest her judgment about what Indiana needed was exactly right. That combination of player influence and front office responsiveness, if it continues, is a genuinely positive development for what this franchise can become. Indiana Fever basketball has carried an identity for 2 seasons that the league learned to exploit. Soft, physically outmatched in the paint, a team that would absorb contact without consequences for the contact givers. A roster whose competitive ceiling was defined as much by what it lacked as by what its franchise player provided. Every team in the WNBA made calculations based on that identity. Defensive game plans were built around physical approaches to Clark that the roster could not punish. Interior defensive strategies against Indiana were constructed with the confidence that the paint was accessible without meaningful physical cost. The Fever's soft identity was not just a media narrative. It was a tactical resource that opponents used against them consistently. The Hines-Allen signing is a direct message to every team that built those game plans. The calculation has changed. The physical approach to defending Clark now carries a cost that it did not carry before. The interior aggression that was available against Boston now operates in a different environment. The confidence that cheap shots go unanswered and physical dominance goes unpunished is no longer supported by the evidence. The enforcer era is not a guarantee of championships. It does not solve every organizational challenge Indiana faces. It does not automatically translate 2 seasons of individual excellence from Clark into collective competitive success. But it changes the identity. And changing the identity changes what opponents have to prepare for. It changes the defensive approach they bring into games. It changes the physical liberties they feel comfortable taking. It changes the psychological atmosphere of what it means to play against Indiana. The defensive analytics say this team's ceiling with the right pieces around Clark is significantly higher than what 2 seasons of watching her fight alone suggested. Plus 9.6 defensive net points leading the entire league is not a marginal addition. It is a foundational piece of what a genuinely competitive roster looks like. The organizational question that matters most now is whether the Hines-Allen signing represents the beginning of a real commitment or an isolated response to a specific problem that Clark identified. If it is isolated, the enforcer era produces some improvement without resolving the larger organizational challenge of building a complete roster around a generational player. If it is the beginning, if the front office has genuinely internalized the lesson that Clark's judgment about what she needs to win should shape organizational decisions, then the Hines-Allen signing is the first move of a different kind of Indiana Fever, one that is being built with genuine intention around the player who can make them historically significant. Clark picked up the phone. The most impactful defensive player in the league answered. The league is on notice. 2 seasons of watching Indiana absorb punishment without consequences ends now. The enforcer is in the building. The analytics support the decision. The franchise star recruited the piece she identified as the missing one. Everything about Indiana Fever basketball just became a different conversation. The only question left is whether the people running this organization understand what they have been handed and are committed to building the rest of it correctly. Clark has done her part. She identified the gap, made the call, and brought in the player with the best defensive net points in the sport. The front office's part is deciding whether that phone call was the beginning of something real. The evidence says it should be. The analytics say the foundation is there. What happens next determines whether Indiana finally becomes what Clark has always had the capacity to make them.